Hello, we are here at Nursery World. I'm sat here with Tamsin, who is an early years consultant and author, and I have borrowed Tamsin for a few minutes to talk a bit about loving pedagogy. So, Tamsin, I was hoping you might be able to define for us what loving pedagogy is. What does that mean for settings?
So I talk about loving pedagogy as meaning a whole approach to how we are in our settings. So I try to combine the caring nature of our role with everything we do, everything we say, everything we are. So our whole ethos, really, it underpins our practice.
Amazing. That's lovely. It sounds so. Oh, it's lovely, isn't it? I wonder how, with the focus now on being early years educators, where does this more kind of caring, loving ethos fit into that role of being a educational authoritative figure compared to being a carer, which we also are as practitioners?
Yeah, absolutely. So our role, as you've said, is both. I see a loving pedagogy as underpinning everything else. Children need to feel safe and secure before they'll be ready to learn. And I would argue that children need to feel loved in order to be ready to learn. So I think it's the first thing. We need to get those relationships right with our children. And if we can do that, then everything else will follow.
What does it mean for children in early years settings to feel loved by their teachers or their practitioners? What's the significance of that?
Okay, so I think children will feel loved in different ways. One of the things I talk about is something that Chapman and Campbell write about, which is love languages. And they say that there are different ways we like to give and receive love. So, for example, we might have a child that feels loved when they're having a cuddle. We might have a child that feels loved when they're given a present, or perhaps when they're told, "I love you," or "Wow, you're amazing." So there are lots of different ways that we might speak to our children in their love languages, if you like. And I think as educators, it's really important that we get to know our children emotionally and work out how they like to feel loved, because then we can speak their love language and help them to feel more loved. So if you have, for example, a child who's always bringing you a little gift in the outside area, they might bring you a feather or a stone or a flower, they're probably speaking a language of gifts. And so if you reciprocate that and, find the most beautiful pebble you can, and you present it to them and say, "Look, I found this for you," then that actually becomes a bit like a love token, and it will help that child to feel loved. So obviously there are lots of examples I can give, but hopefully that's a practical one.
That's lovely. I want a nice shiny pebble.
Yeah.
Something else you talk about is being a behaviour detective. That sounds very kind of glamorous, but what does it mean?
Well, it links in quite well with loving pedagogy, actually, because it's back to knowing the children really well. So I believe that all behaviour is communication. So we've got to try and work out what the children are communicating to us through their behaviour. So getting to know the children really well is going to help with that. But we'll be asking ourselves questions like, is the behaviour, perhaps it's schematic play that they're actually engaged in. So it might not be misbehaviour as such. Perhaps it's a child telling us that they need more attention and love. In which case the answer is to give them attention and love, but obviously in appropriate ways that we feel we can. It could be that the child is telling us they're unhappy about something. And so our role as a behaviour detective is to listen to the child, not just listening to their words, but also listening to their behaviour and what they're doing and their actions. And so, yeah, it's all linked together really, but that's how I see it.
Lovely. As professional educators and as also professional carers, how our relationships are with children is a fine line between a service that we provide to parents, obviously, and a service we provide to the children, and a genuine caring relationship. How, as practitioners and teachers, can we navigate that balance in the context of a loving pedagogy? How can we define our relationships to children in a positive, loving way without it becoming unprofessional?
Yeah. So we do have a fine line to tread, absolutely, and safeguarding needs to be our number one priority. So that being said, nurturing our children and enabling them to feel loved, I would argue, is, you know, a very close second. So I think it's really important that we have an open and frank discussion with families about our approach. So if we do adopt a loving pedagogy, having that written into our ethos and policies in the setting will be really helpful. So parents know that if their child falls over and hurts themselves, they will be cuddled, or even if a child just initiates that themselves. You know, children will sit on our laps during stories. You know, there will be an element of touch within the loving pedagogy. And making sure that parents are comfortable with what we're offering and the way that we are with their children is important. But I think it's also about each educator deciding for themselves how comfortable they are as well. So I know educators who would happily say to a child, I love you. But I equally know many excellent educators who would rather not say that, and would say, if a child says I love you to them, rather than reciprocate and say I love you back, they would say, oh, thank you, that makes me feel really happy, which is a lovely response as well. So I think it's about being honest with yourself, being honest with parents and carers, and you know, adopting the loving pedagogy to the extent that you feel you're able.
I think that may have answered my next question, but I'll ask it. In your book, you talk about how love can be about actions as opposed to feelings. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes. So when we say we love somebody, it's not just a feeling, it's not just that lovey-dovey stuff. It is actually about how we treat them. It's about being respectful, it's about doing things for them. You know, I know my husband will make me a cup of tea, and that is a loving act that he will do for me. And so there are things we do for the people we love, and we need to be speaking love through our actions as well as through our words, in the settings as well. So has that elaborated a little bit?
That's perfect. If we wanted to adopt a loving pedagogy in our setting, you talked about enshrining that in the ethos or making that sort of very explicit to parents. What might that look like? Is it as simple as saying we have adopted a loving pedagogy, this is what that means, or do we need to be more explicit when explaining to parents what this is?
I suggest we do talk about love, and we use the languages associated with love as well, because in English we have one word describing love, and it kind of describes all the different facets of love. So I would use the word love to mean the love I have for my husband and my children and my pet dog and the children I've looked after in settings. And so actually they're different. You know, when I think about the levels of love, if I can put it like that I have, it's different for those different groups. But it doesn't make it any less loving, and it's still love. So I think talking about it and explaining what we mean can sometimes help to alleviate any concerns that there could be. So, you know, adopting a loving pedagogy isn't without its challenges, and there will be parents or maybe other educators who don't feel it's appropriate to talk about love with young children, in the sense of us loving them. Obviously, I would argue that it is appropriate, and in fact, I would argue that it is the best approach to adopt.
That's amazing. Tamsin, thank you so much. Thank you for being with us.